with our keynote conversation of the evening. And it will be a conversation about Futurosity between Douglas Coupland and Shumon Basar. Welcome. Douglas, a Canadian novelist, visual artist and designer. He has published 14 novels, a collection of short stories, 7 non-fiction books, and a number of dramatic works and screenplays for film and television. Douglas's novels and visual work synthesize high and low culture, web, technology, religion, and all changes in human existence. Last year we at Witte de Wit were very honored to present Douglas' first large-scale solo exhibition in Europe, which formed the inspiration for Futurosity. Shumon Basar is a writer, thinker, and cultural critic. He is the co-author of The Age of Earthquakes, a guide to the extreme present, together with Douglas Coupland and Hans Ulrich Obrist. I always slip art into everything. Did you notice? Yeah. He's edited many books, and he's commissioner of the Global Art Forum in Dubai. The theme of which is last edition was also on the future, correct? Right. A very warm welcome and a big hand for Douglas Coupland and Shumon Basar.
Hi. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for making it happen, and thank you to all our incredible, gracious hosts. Hi, Doug.
Hello. So, Shumon, before I came to Holland, I had a dental procedure, and I took 2 painkillers about an hour ago, so I don't know where my head's going to be. I'm just warning you in advance.
All the better.
Okay.
All the better to understand you. So how the next hour or so, actually, hour is okay, yeah. It's going to work is I'm going to set the scene. Then Doug has a reading from one of his recent texts. And then we're going to go back and forth, time traveling through the texture of time. And this is actually quite an important phrase, and it's something that I think the two of us have been thinking about, talking about, writing about a lot over the last few years. And so, in a sense, you're eavesdropping on a conversation that goes back many years and probably will go forward many centuries. So, to begin, are you nostalgic? Does it make you feel sick? In the 16th century, nostalgia meant a hypochondria of the heart. It's a really beautiful phrase, a hypochondria of the heart. As if you were inventing symptoms related to lost times past. Today, we have anniversaries. They are modern navigation instruments to help us against the accumulation of time. They organize time into short bursts of collective memory. But, of course, too much past, and you cancel the future. But the idea of the future does have a past. It has many pasts. There was a time when people didn't see time as a line that progresses forward from here to there, me to the horizon. Time gained meaning through repetition and reenactment. Many moons later, the future became a province of Western Europe from the 15th century onwards, as Western Europe expanded and exported its colonial territories via the oceans. 2 centuries later, London nominated itself as Greenwich Mean Time, making it the center of global time. The 15th century is also when the word future appears for the first time in European languages. This can't be a coincidence. We then have the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the French Enlightenment, all the various avant-gardes that you're very familiar with. All these things continued this reorganization of the globe from a north-south division to an east-west division. A few years into the 21st century, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after 9/11, and the start of the war on terror, I arrived in Dubai in 2005, and I felt maybe, just maybe, this 500-year story had come to an end. The tectonic plates were shifting again. The end of history seemed to mean nothing here, but the future was a kind of salvation. As Yuri said, in Dubai, and it's also been Doha and in Kuwait and London, I organize an event called the Global Art Forum. And we have a theme each year, and we have the pleasure of inviting amazing people to come and think loudly with us. And the one we just convened in March was called "The Future Was," and so these were some of the tag keywords of the sessions during this global art forum. The future was cloud, space, future, enchanted, market, smart, sun ra, desert, past, diachoric, overcast, collective, two semicircles away from the face. And we had amazing people like Hito Steil, like Eli Ayash, Alice Gorman, who's a space archaeologist, one of the founders of space archaeology, which is the treatment of debris, space debris in the orbit, as archaeology, as human archaeology, as another way of telling the history of the 20th century. And a few years before that, I organized a global art forum called The Medium of Media. And during that, I invited Doug and our friend, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, to Doha and Dubai. And there we talked, amongst many other things, about Marshall McLuhan, media and the world that he never saw happening, but he also kind of predicted. Marshall McLuhan, who some of you may know, some of you may not know, was a pivotal media theorist, Canadian media theorist, and he's in essence been boiled down to two tweets. The medium is the message, and the global village. But in fact, his oeuvre, his thinking is vast, it's galactic. And Doug wrote in 2010 a kind of anti-biography on Marshall McLuhan, which I really urge you to read. And in a sense, I was inspired by that to make that the theme then for the Global Art Forum. Anyway, the three of us got together and had these conversations and started talking about McLuhan's legacy, but in particular, what would McLuhan have made of today? Right? So he died in 1980, but he seemed to see many things coming, but he didn't live to see them. So we then together made this book, which is called The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present. It was published by Penguin last year as a paperback. And it was very consciously our attempt at updating Marshall McLuhan's very famous, McLuhan, Fiore, and Agel's famous 1967 paperback, The Medium is the Massage, which is a kind of quick-fire surfing through the world that electronic media had made by the late 60s. And so we decided to update that to the 21st century, but keeping this very 1960s format of the black and white paperback. And for us to be published by Penguin was also a great kind of honor and made a lot of sense. So I'm just going to show you a few pages from this, and also just to deploy this term, the extreme present, because I will come back to it later on. So here are a few pages. So the images were sourced from 35 contemporary artists, amazing range starting with what we call the 89 plus generation, all the way up to people like Hans-Peter Feldman, Rosemarie Trockel, and Michael Stipe in between. So at the beginning of the book, it starts like this. Have you maybe noticed that our lives are no longer feeling like stories? Our lives are becoming a lineup of tasks. Our sense of time is beginning to shrink. I experience more time than you do, LOL, ha ha ha. FYI, Doug, we were talking about words of the year earlier. You do know that this was last year's word of the year, don't you?
LOL.
the crying emoji.
Oh, that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
That's,
So this was, we've had, what have been some of the words of the year recently?
truthiness.
Truthiness.
Was one. That was last year. The 2 years was vaping.
It was vaping. It was a close call between vaping and normcore. Normcore should have won, but vaping won.
There's this new word I've been hearing just in the last month. It's called phygital. Have you heard that?
Nope.
It's a mixture of digital and physical, and it describes this new kind of 2.5-dimensional 3D printer universe that we're entering, which is sort of neither fish nor fowl. It's its own thing. So you heard it here first. Digital.
Digital. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Doug, who's going to tell us a little bit about the super future. Will you please welcome Douglas Coupland? Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, I'm going to read out I'm going to read it. Okay, I'm going to hold my microphone correctly. I'm going to read a piece that came out probably about a month or so ago, and it's called "Escaping the Super Future." I find myself reading books of short stories these days. Short stories don't take as long to read as novels, and if you read a few in a row, it feels just like you're binging on Netflix. I've also found that when it comes to reading, and if you really want to annoy someone, just tell them you're going to take a week off to do nothing but read. Their eyes will goggle and their reptile cortex will flare with envy, and make it even worse by saying that you're also going to go offline for your reading week. You may as well tell them that you're going to spend the week snorkeling on the Amalfi Coast with Brangelina. Taking time off solely to read has become something akin to temporal ecotourism, a visit to a mind space that seems ever more distant day by day. And lately, I've been experiencing a new temporal sensation that's odd to articulate, but I do think is shared by most people. It's this, that until recently, the future was something that was out there, just up ahead of us, something to anticipate or to dread, but it was always away from the present. But not anymore. Somewhere in the past few years, the present somehow melted into the future. And we're now living inside the future 24/7, and this weirdly electric and buzzy sensation that shows no sign of stopping, and if anything, it grows ever more intense. Elsewhere, I've labeled this experience the extreme present, or another label for this new realm might be the super future. In this super future, I feel like I'm clamped onto a temporal roller coaster, actually, that runs way far off into the horizon. Like, wait, when is this thing supposed to end? Is it ever going to end? Help, I want a pill called 1995. I want a 1-year holiday from change. But that's not going to happen. See, the future is always supposed to be a mess, isn't it? I think it's funny that the way people have an almost impossible time envisioning a future that isn't a dystopian wasteland. Growing up in the 1970s, the year 2016 was going to be a wasteland populated by rifle-toting Charlton Heston, zombies, and the Statue of Liberty poking out from a beach. Both oil and fresh water would be non-existent, no politics, just anarchy. But by many measurable statistical standards, right now is the best time ever in our history. And yet, mostly we bitch and complain and worry. It's what we humans do. And I think the biggest surprise for 1970s Rip Van Winkle awakening in 2016 might be oil, cheap and plentiful. Wait, how did that happen? And God, look at the variety of high-quality produce in even the most dismal grocery store. And cars look great and they don't belch blue smoke, and the gays seem to be part of society at large. And wait, this is 2016. Count me in. it's hard to accept that our new super future mind state is permanent and that it's not going to go away. How could it? Our devices that cause this aren't going to go away either. They're just going to get better and faster, and we're going to embed ourselves into the superstructure of the super future even more deeply. It makes me wonder if the most... Rotterdam is a city that's alive with sound. I think legally car alarms have to stop after 30 seconds. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and try and think over the noise. It's really hard for me to think. Okay, thank you. Okay. It makes me wonder if the most important thing we could invent right now would be for technology that takes away our bottomless fear of missing out, our need to read the latest news update, our latest hookup or our latest upgrade. What kind of technology would that be? How would it free us from our current super future prison? How could it convince us that everything is actually okay? How do we invent our way out of this mess? Human beings were not built for progress, and maybe a bit of change here and there, and a bit of adaptability, but not for what we're now collectively enduring. And no animal's actually built that way. And until recently, we lived in a cave or a hut, and you assumed that our great-great-grandchildren would be living in the exact same cave, the same hut, and their lives would be in no way different from ours. But when did that all end? 1850? Dear Industrial Revolution, thank you for nothing. Last month, I was visiting a friend in Toronto, my editor, and I asked her, so Anne, what's killing publishing this week? Publishers are a really morose lot. And she said, oh, that's easy, television binge viewing. She wasn't being facetious. People now measurably use the time that they once spent reading novels now to binge watch Netflix or HBO. And then the next day at work, they discuss what they're watching the same way people once described novels in the workplace. What episode are you on? What season? Don't spoil it for me. Don't tell me. And they might as well have been at the water cooler discussing Catcher in the Rye in 1957. Now, a few paragraphs back, I asked you what sort of technology it would be that could help rescue us from this non-stop trapped inside the future nagging buzz we all share living here in the 21st century. And this is a trick question because we already have the technology. It's called books. We all know it. It's a very rare and a very honest person who will cop to the truth that they don't read half as much fiction as they did 10 years ago. People seem to be buying novels, they just don't read them as much. And they just go in that pile beside the bed that topples over when you reach to plug in the laptop's power cord. For a recent museum show, I made t-shirts that read, I miss my pre-internet brain. And we photographed them on 17-year-old models, and everyone had a good laugh. Me, I don't miss my pre-internet brain, and to be honest, I don't really remember it anymore. And that may well be a necessary step to survive in the upcoming 100 years. Nostalgia for your pre-2005-ish brain may actively be holding you back from living a better life right now. Who's to say? The world only spins forward, and if you want a portal back to the way things were, you can read a book. But the moment you finish it, you'll be right back here, and that's probably better than nothing. Thank you. Back to you, Shumon.
Thank you, Doug. I think what we're going to do now is press this button on the right that I certainly have never pressed before. Doug, have you ever felt lucky?
Hello. I have never pushed the I feel lucky button. What happens is time stops.
Has anyone ever pressed the I'm feeling lucky button here?
That's like 3% of the audience. That's just, we're all pathetic. Okay.
Doug, isn't it interesting that only 3% of the population pressed that button, but they've still left it there? You've worked at Google before. Explain that. It's the red pill and the blue pill?
I honestly, is this active or is this a screen grab?
It's a screen grab.
Okay.
I'm not on...
No, it's
hold on, I am online.
No, if
Shall I? Should we do it?
No, like Edward Snowden appears on the screen. Okay. We'll make sure we don't see your bookmarks.
Ready? Yeah. Ready? You sure we can't go back after
Do we have to put a word in first?
Oh, we have to look for something. No, isn't it just like... It's just I'm feeling... You just...
Put in Edward Snowden.
What happens if you don't put...
Just type in your own name and then say I'm feeling lucky.
It sends you back to second year university.
Edward... No, it doesn't work, does it? Really?
Wait, but you're at Google Deluxe. What is this?
What happened?
You put in the box.
The
there.
3% that have done this, how does it work? So I put something in. So, no.
Yeah, but you should switch off the autocomplete.
Really?
Ah.
Really? Okay, we'll leave this for another time. That's why only 3% of us have done this. But figuratively speaking, we're about to feel lucky. So Doug, I would like to go back and then see if we can catch up to the accelerating super future. You grew up in Vancouver. You were born in '61, and so your idyllic childhood years was spent... you were born in Germany. What age did you move back to Canada?
We moved when I was 3. I have no memories of life before that. I grew up in a suburb called West Vancouver, which is, if you look at any photo of Vancouver, it's the mountains. And it was so high up and so far away from the cities that it was essentially rural. And it also, it was largely developed right after World War II, when there were things like plywood and improvements in glass. And that Scandinavian metaphor of transparency as a windows as a metaphor for social transparency was very much in operation. But the same mountain slope was logged in the year 1905. And the trees had grown back to a point, maybe about 60 years or so. And at school, we'd go down in the canyon. And there was this old railway bridge that they used to get logs up and down the canyon. And it had turned sort of rotten, and big chunks of moss and trees growing out from it. And oh my God, you mean there was something here before right now? And it's still hard for me to believe. So from where I come from, the future is never at the expense of excavating what's underneath. It's always at the expense of nature. And of course, this completely disregards the fact that there were indigenous people there for 20,000 years before any of this. I tend to only look forward by nature, which is, I think, how my experience with Rotterdam actually began, is probably the one city in Europe, because of it just got so completely wiped out in the war. It's like, fuck it, let's just go forward and light future only. So,
and talking about kind of catastrophic annihilation, you've spoken a lot about how your not only your early childhood, but by consequence, your future visual imagination, and also your kind of existential situation in the world was largely, or to a large degree, defined by the potentiality of Armageddon happening any moment. And I wonder, well, two parts to that question. Can you remember how young you were when you grew cognizant of the fact that there was this thing, like this, about to happen, and what that did to an idea of the future in that world?
Well, I mean, I was born on a Canadian NATO base in Germany, and I mean, I exist because of that. There was Lyndon Johnson and the American news networks thought it would be a very good idea to put the Vietnam War on TV every single day, and they spent an insane amount of money and went to a lot of work shipping this, what we would now call raw, uncut footage of the war, and it backfired completely. And at one point there were 500,000 soldiers or troops over in Vietnam, Americans, and they had to come up with a system in order to, like, how do we choose who's next? So they had a lottery, and it was on TV, and they had this big cage full of ping pong balls, and they reached in, and the first birthday they pulled out was September 14th, and then the next ball they picked out was December 30th, which is my birthday. And my brother's there like, you're fucked, you're gonna die in Vietnam, like you're going right now. And then the other thing that was happening was the nuclear tradition. And nuclear war was always actually supposed to happen over Canada, where the US and Soviet ICBMs collided with each other. So it was like just a bit more, like I needed any more stress. Interestingly, I will say, and this is a very heretical thought, but back in Nevada, near Las Vegas, back in the 50s, when they would do a test, usually they did them very, very early in the morning. And when they were doing them, a little bell would go off in the casino, and like, hey everyone, if you want to see a real live nuclear blast, come on out and have a look. And you see all these people who are addicted to gambling out in the street, watching this mushroom cloud, and like, that's what freedom looks like. And then now, can you imagine if even one tiny little bomb went off somewhere, they'd shut down the entire country. And here's the heresy: nuclear bombs aren't that bad. And I know this is going to bite me in the ass sometime, but it's actually not something to worry about. Young people don't care about the bomb. Lucky them. So anyhow, this is all to say apocalypse. Time is about to end. What is time, anyways? Next slide.
Well, just is this working? Yeah. Just as a footnote to that, one of our guests at the Global Art Forum this year was João Ribas, and he had curated an amazing show at the Musée Geraldo in Porto last year called Under the Clouds. And João had discovered an extraordinary narrative that links basically these two clouds. And so the cloud that sat anxiously over Doug's childhood head,
it was the 20th century cloud.
20th century cloud actually did give birth to the cloud that we now so enjoy. And the short version, I won't go into details, and I urge you to look up this show and read João's writings. It's really fantastic. But basically the kind of information, the communication network that had to be put in place in the 60s that would assure that, say, if hypothetically the Soviet Union were to launch an unprovoked attack at the United States, that there would be a simultaneous response quickly enough that would not necessarily, ideally would take out the missiles in the clouds, but would also maybe ensure mutually like symmetrical Armageddon. That communication network, João says, is also one of the beginnings of the internet.
Well, the information had to be made diffuse enough that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, X number of attacks wouldn't stall the transmission of information everywhere.
Yeah. So, Doug, moving on a little bit then to the 70s, the late 60s and the early 70s, I was wondering whether you read science fiction and what kind of science fiction you read at that time.
I read, I guess what you would call classic science fiction. Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, a lot of the stuff that began in the 30s. And then I don't know if it was a phase, but I stopped reading it. And then so I've been on the sidelines. And what I've noticed lately is that science fiction is actually not called science fiction anymore. It's just called fiction. And it was this process that took nearly a century to get to. And I think that we realize that our identities as a species are so wrapped up with this crazy whatever that you can't really say us, them anymore. We're not cyborgs, but something has happened.
And so, actually, you know, the first book, or the first novel I read of yours was Girlfriend in a Coma. And I hope some of you have read that. If you haven't, I really, really urge you to. It's very, very beautiful. It came out, I think, in '96. And in my mind, it's the closest of your novels to come to the sci-fi genre. But in a very particular way, and that doesn't fit in classic tropes of science fiction. I was wondering if you could maybe share with us what happens in Girlfriend in a Coma, and why that book seemed to take on a sort of science fiction atmosphere to it, particularly of time travel.
Well, something that's obsessed me now for I think about 2 decades is in a very detached way is what happens to you after you die. If you're religious, you go to an afterlife. If you're not religious, it's all over and the world continues on inside this thing called the future. And I, for that book especially, but still I continue to look for situations where eternity and the future can coexist with communication between each other. And the only place I think that can actually happen is in art, whether in writing or visual art. And so Girlfriend in a Coma took this set of characters that grew up essentially in the neighborhood. It takes place in my neighborhood. They grew up with the same absence of religion, but they needed to believe that there was something that transcended merely just the future, but they didn't want to buy into any sort of orthodoxy. And I think that's probably an encapsulation of the world right now.
And there's, without necessarily giving the ending away, sleep plays a pivotal role in this book.
Well, sleep is a strange thing. We all do it. We never talk about it. And there's nothing more boring than someone else saying, let me tell you about this dream I had last night. And you sort of mentally go to your happy place. I guess in the end, sleep is our Darwinian evolutionary response to the fact that the world takes 24 hours to spin. I don't know if I can talk intelligently enough about it on the spur of the moment.
I urge you to read it, particularly if you're a fan of the science fiction genre, because it plays with it, I think, in a very unusual way. You then go to art school, 1981, to study sculpture for the next few years. And I was wondering whether you could say something about how, what was the local art scene or art world that you entered into, and what did the future of art feel like at that point in the early 80s?
At that point I went to what was once called the Vancouver School of Art. It's actually called the Emily Carr College of Art and Design. Now it's the Emily Carr University of Art and Design. But it was just basically this really small art school in the absolute middle of nowhere. And it was kind of neat. It wasn't like being in Cal Arts or RISD, where it was a big fish, or big pond, and you had to be a big fish. It was this nowhere pond that didn't care what size fish you were. the 60s were over, thank God, and like the hippies were all too stoned to actually have any effect in this running of the school. Punk had just happened, it was new wave, and political correctness hadn't happened yet either, so there's this fantastic openness in the air that you could ask anyone about anything. I mean, all the teachers slept with their students. You know, weirdly, people smoked in the class, and if this was class, that would be the smoking and that would be the non-smoking side of the room. And there was freedom. There was an intellectual freedom that I don't think you really find on any campus anymore. But that's just me being a nostalgic old curmudgeon here. What was the future? Oh boy. It was strange because it was 10 minutes before Macintosh computers came in, and I took typography. And there was this guy named Greg Pregrocki who had just gone through a bitter divorce, and he was always angry. And we had to sit there with gouache, and we had to draw Helvetica, and we had to draw Garamond, including numbers and European diacritical marks on top of the vowels. And he's like, type is dead. There'll never be any new type ever in the future. Like, I don't even know why I bother teaching this class. And then, of course, Macintosh computers came in, and the most unparalleled design revolution in human history came. So I do find that the moment anyone says something is dead is like bet the farm on it, because that's when it's going to explode. And I think we could just sense that, I think, back in the early 80s. But at the same time, I mean, we've all collectively endured so much change in the last 5 years, 2 years alone. I think the young people would be appalled at how little change it took for everyone to be overwhelmed back in the 70s or the 80s. Like, telephones went from rotary to push button. It's like, wow. And it really was like that, and here we get Google. We know the answer to everything anytime we want. Oh, we're bored. And as I say, we are a wretched species. So.
And after your time at Emily Carr, you go to Milan, and in Milan you come across a design movement called Memphis, which also had started actually in 1981, but in a sense had began to peak by the mid-80s perhaps, right? Could you say something about that experience? Because there's something interesting about Memphis in relation to the future and the past that I think is still resonant today.
I want to do it. I mean, I think we have a very educated group here, but who here has never heard of Memphis? That's like way more people than have never pushed I feel lucky. Memphis was, and is technically, it was a design, I love this. As you can see, it was very, very brightly colored, incredibly reductive geometric shapes that sometimes would playfully address the past as a square with a triangle on top would be the Parthenon or what have you. And it was a radical breakaway from all sorts of other theoretical design movements. You probably didn't know it was called Memphis, but I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of this stuff before. It's very, very hard to live with. You put any one of these pieces in your environment, and it just...
Unless you have Memphis socks.
It colonizes
a room.
Colonizes your entire...
Look at that.
It's the design equivalent of big hair or something. That was going on, but it also, there was something radical about it. It really was, I liked it, I still like it, but I could never live with it. It died a very ignominious and quick death. And now apparently there's a bit of a resurgence happening. I think also, I mean, those chairs, those black and white striped chairs, for example, the laminates that they used to make these things, they're all decomposing. So they're very hard to archive or keep together in the end. God, I love those black and white chairs.
These ones?
Yeah. Those are sexy.
They're amazing.
It's okay to say something sexy without a PC infraction, I think. Okay. So where's this going?
Well, this is, well, obviously, I mean, I guess I'm sort of moving us through decade by decade in terms of either how the future was phrased, or framed, or in this case, designed, because this is happening really also at the peak of postmodern theory. Jameson's postmodernism, the cultural logic of late capitalism, is 84. It's basically the same time. And but I mean, maybe we can come back to this later in terms of, for me, what's remarkable, because as you say, it happened. It became discredited very quickly, but now this is almost held up as a kind of as pieces of robust modernity, or like things that in a way never date. And I was just interested in relation to your biography and moving different
you could
cities.
put one of these things in 1,000 yards away. You could say that is a Memphis object. It has a definite aura. But the other thing that happened in the 80s was it really felt as though time, and we're talking 88, 89 here, when I began writing fiction, it felt as if, as a culture, we had lost the ability to create artifacts or documents or music or anything that could in some way timestamp a period of life. It felt like the age of eras was over. And I think you had, Francis Fukuyama saying that history's over, liberal democracy is won, and there you go again. The moment says something's over, kaboom, it's about to explode. It was quite surprising about the 1990s. After just a dismal start, suddenly grunge happened, and there was this whole new look to a decade. And then the 2000s came, and I thought we were right back in 1989 again, that we could never generate items or objects or artifacts that felt like they were from a period of time, and boom, suddenly we have hipsterism, and we have artisanal this, and we also have this thing called the internet with its strange undesigned design. It's not as if, Tom Dixon and Tom Ford sat down and said, let's design the internet. There, that's what it looks like. It's the design of nothing. On the right there, by the way, is Eric Hobsbawm, who I always wanted to meet. And we came 3 weeks from meeting at the Serpentine in a marathon, and he died. And it's sort of evil to make his death all about me. But I really did want to meet him. The Age of Extremes was the history of the 20th century. And he was the editor of Marxism Today. And I'm not a Marxist, but I love Marxism because it's all about ownership and capital and who owns what and who controls the rights to that. And in a weird way, when all other sort of isms are useless, Marxism is very helpful for looking at history with a fresh viewpoint.
Again, I think we probably couldn't urge you more to read Hobsbawm, particularly his trilogy that predates this one. In a sense, this is the fourth of a trilogy, weirdly enough. But the trilogy looks at the long 19th century. And then here he gives this beautiful description of the short 20th century as something that happens between 1914 and 1991. And then, you could then put this in your bookshelf next to something by Baudrillard, who would say the 21st century starts with 9/11. And so, Doug, the question then is, this period between 91 and 2001, what happened there in terms of our relationship to the future, do you think?
Oh, boy. I remember whenever it was in 1989, being in the parking lot of Gelson's Deli in Palm Springs, California, and the cover, God, it's even hard to talk about, but the cover of the Los Angeles Times said, "Communism is officially over." And it was like, like this whole chunk of concrete is lifted from my body. And I thought, maybe there's nothing left to worry about. Of course, the moment you start thinking there's nothing to worry about, kaboom, there'll be all these things happening. But the 90s, where I think we might look back on them as the last good decade, it was a brief 10-year or a decade holiday from history for everybody almost. And and in the 1990s, we also had this weird thing called the internet. And I was working at Wired in 94 and 95, and I remember getting mad at Kevin Kelly, just like, Kevin, there's nowhere to go on this. Show me something, anything that's interesting on the internet. Well, why don't we look here? And I, that dial-up noise, and there's a black and white fuzzy photo of the north coast of California and the Oregon southern coast. And what's that? Why, that's a real-time weather map of Northern California that refreshes once every 6 hours. And that's not real-time. And so a lot of, for me, my visual work in the 1990s was trying to do design work and come up with things. We didn't even call them blogs, we just called them diaries or whatever, to create the original aesthetic of the internet. And it's all archived out there at prelinger.org. And if you want to lose about 12 hours of your life, just go there and you'll just fall down the rabbit hole of time. It was a wonderful thing.
And, I mean, your own life and your career, in a way, takes on a public visibility in the 90s. Generation X, 1990? 91. So exactly as the Soviet... Did you cause the end of the Soviet Union, Doug? With Generation X? And then there's this flurry of novels and non-fiction books, and you're very quickly labeled a sort of futurist. How did that feel, to be labeled as the guy with the finger on the pulse? Did that?
Oh, it's just embarrassing. It's not like I spend my life going out and trying to find these things and like to pounce on them, which I think Naomi Klein kind of does.
She's also Canadian. What is it about you guys?
Oh, so it just seems to me that there are always these very obvious things. Like they're so big you can't really see them. And I always try and pull back and get some distance. I did write that biography about Marshall McLuhan. And he was this incredibly old, kind of boring, really kind of stuffy guy who taught 18th century literature at the University of Toronto, which in 1960 was also technically, measurably, scientifically the most boring place on the planet. And he kind of anticipated in quite large detail what the internet was going to be, but he actually didn't know the interface. He only could describe it in these terms that sounded really, nuts. And someone was asking what would Marshall McLuhan make of 2016. He would have loved to have seen how the interfaces played out, like the mouse, the trackpad, eBay, Etsy, porn. I mean, he'd have the whole way it actually worked. And my thing about McLuhan is that, well, he was right about things up until now, so he's probably right about things to come after this. So I keep on rereading them, trying to find out maybe what does come next. But to actually, hi, I'm going to go out and look for the future, that's just, ugh.
But then again, Steven Spielberg did call you up and say, Doug, what will the future look like in Minority Report?
That was so much fun. Oh, my God. I think Stephen wanted to create...
Stephen, there you go.
Oh, sorry.
First name basis, right? Stephen. Stevie.
He didn't want... Mr. Spielberg...
Tell us about the phone call.
He didn't want a future that was, at that point, the default future. The Blade Runner, everything's in Japanese, it's nighttime and it's raining. Which is basically, they did that because it was inexpensive to film and they didn't have very good CG back then. So myself and a few people, we had this weird sort of 48-hour like grok in this hotel in Santa Monica, and we tried to figure out, what does the future look like? Is it noisy or quiet? It's probably quiet. Tom Cruise's character in that movie, by the way, is 72 years old, but he looks 32. And in the future, you can have these things called young old people, which you sort of get an inkling of in a place like Vienna, Austria, where it has the most geriatric population of anywhere on Earth. And when you get older, you're quite inflexible and you have your pattern and you don't want to be around anything that's annoying. And so the future will be filled with young old people. What kind of pets will they have? What's the unknown known? What's the unknown unknown? And that's why I think the movie, I mean, it's a wonderful story, but it's also the really hard work that went into doing the future at a time when it was still almost impossibly expensive to do good 3D.
But that it was unbelievably prescient, it seems to me, in a number of things. So here on the left, we have Tom basically swiping, right? Swiping these screens that appear around him, moving bits of information, data from one virtual screen to another. But this whole notion of getting rid of the keyboard and the hand gesture, unbelievable. On the right, we have individually tailored advertisements, right? So you would walk past, and instead of a billboard saying the same thing it says to all of us, it would say, "Hello, good morning, Mr. Cruz. Feeling tired, feeling hungry, etc., etc." All of these things are happening right now. So how could you say something? I mean, that accuracy, where does that come from?
Well, we really dropped the football on transportation. Transportation was the single hardest thing to figure out what was going to happen. And here we are, maybe 15 years later, and it is self-driving cars. It's going to happen. But if you had said in that meeting, "Oh, I know, the cars will all be self-driving," everyone would have said, "That's just stupid." So, Bill Gates, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, he's best friends with the smartest and richest people on the planet. They all hang out together. They all talk about what's the next big thing. And he completely misses search engines. He completely misses iPhones, iPads, sort of touchscreen technology, which is all to say that there's no official place where the future comes from. It comes out of the most random places, and it usually happens very quickly. And if it gets venture capital, it gets turned into capitalism very quickly, which is a little bit disturbing. But I look at the Minority Report now, and I'd give us a C+.
Really?
Yeah.
Why? That's quite harsh.
I know, it's kind of, when you're trying to design the year 2070, and you're already eclipsed by 2016, it's like, it's humbling.
C+. We'll open it up to questions in a bit, so please get percolating. I'm going to skip. We're going to skip the 2000s, and I'm just going to read something, and then ask Doug something else. So I wrote this not so long ago. A few hours ago, before I got on this plane to London, lying in bed on the 36th floor of a hotel in Dubai, I heard that David Bowie had died. Immediately, I thought of Doug. And that time that Doug told me that David Bowie was petrified of dying. I write to Doug immediately, then to our good friend Sophia. I'm spinning in a strange sadness on the 36th floor of a hotel in Dubai. I think this is the sadness of shock, because we had heard that David Bowie was ill, or not ill. Then he was okay, and then he looked amazing in the recent videos, not the tragic victim of cancer. He seemed ever vivid, ageless, and alive. Within mere minutes, Doug calls me. His voice is croaking. He's in shock too. Doug tells me he's sitting in the same chair as when I came into his kitchen and told him about Michael Jackson dying in 2009. But this time, it's much, much worse. Doug talks to me about seeing Ziggy Stardust, and the memories are flooding in, and he apologizes. He's tearing up, and so am I. This hurts. What is there to say? I think this is what there is to say. That some texture of time, when our own pasts met Bowie's visions of the future, has died. Of course, a part of us has died. That's the cliche, that's the easy part to understand. But perhaps there's also the fact that David Bowie is immortal. He always was, even in death, and we are not immortal. I've always thought that David Bowie, as Thomas Jerome Newton in the film The Man Who Fell to Earth, was the most beautiful man that ever lived, because he was also an alien hiding amongst men on Earth. The future has died a little more now that David Bowie has died. So Doug, why were we crying as grown men when you called me?
Let's go ahead one image. Marketing people will tell you that the music you get the most sentimental about later on in your life is whatever you were listening to when you were 23 and a half years old. And so when you're 65, like guaranteed whatever car you're driving or being a passenger in, that's the music you're going to be listening to. A friend of mine, Rex Ray, who actually just coincidentally died last year, he was David Bowie's web designer for about 15 years. And David Bowie's issue was that he couldn't handle aging. That, you know, here he was immortalized as the Thin White Duke or Aladdin Sane or Ziggy Stardust, but he himself had to grow old in public. You know, like, it's a very hard thing to do. And so, coincidentally, for another project I'm doing in Canada, which is all about redheads, of all things, I had been, I have a list of famous redheads: Elizabeth I, George Washington, Lucille Ball, David Bowie, and Margaret. And about a year ago, I went on to eBay and I got a plaster casting made by a makeup technician in England of David Bowie's head, which you see here. And then, so the show, which was just upstairs last year, we put this piece in as you see it, and we just called it David Bowie Death Mask. And it was basically, it's kind of like Damien Hirst Shark in a Tank. It's the impossibility to imagine being David Bowie ever being actually dead or dying. And we took it down, you guys took it down, and 2 days later he died. And we're going to be restaging the same show in Munich at the Villa Stuck come September. And there's this weird issue we're in. It's, you know, the future versus eternity. How do we show this piece again in Munich, knowing that David Bowie is now dead? And do we put it inside a glass box and make it almost like a Museum of Natural History piece rather than an art piece? And we don't have the answer yet. So, I mean, I just feel so sad looking at this. And yeah, oh. I was reading the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung online, and I saw David Bowie is tot. And it was like, I mean, and, you know, Prince has died, and it's very sad, but David Bowie, he really did, like, you know, part of me died, so.
Yuri, do we have any questions from the audience? I have one or two more questions, but we do have time. Anyone?
You guys have been sitting for 2 hours and not fidgeting very much. I couldn't do it myself.
Yeah, thank you for your talk and conversation. I have a question, and that is a question for Doug, of course. So what is the space that we have as critical thinkers in the discussion about the future? And I guess I'm touching upon capital interests here, and how funding of specific concepts influences research and artistic production. So then my question would be, do we have a space of thinking critically out of the realm of capital on the topic of the future? And I'm basing this question further on your work and your experience of the entanglement with capital in your residency with Google. Thank you.
Can you stand up? I can't see your face. Well, hello. Now I know. I wrote this one piece, and actually I do a column at the Financial Times of London, which sort of makes it even more capital-driven. Thing about capitalism is that it's really boring. And Marx actually came up with the term as a pejorative. He never thought it would actually become an actual framework for looking at the world. And this one thing I wrote was capitalism kills you in the end, but first capitalism kills, but first it puts you to sleep. And there is a sort of seductive way of looking at the world through a capitalist lens. It's not enough. I completely disagree with it. I kind of I like Google because they are in this ontologically unique point in history. If you look, everyone says they're too big, they have too much power. If you look at, say, Bell Telephone, AT&T in the States in 1984, they chopped it into 7 baby bells, or 7 miniature companies, so they could properly compete with each other. And so everyone says, well, chop up Google, but you can't chop up a search engine. And this is sort of the issue. And then, well, how about making Holland has its own search engine? So you're asking your government to create your search engine. That's just even more terrifying than anything. And in any event, it doesn't work. Just look at China. And so I look at things like Google with great optimism because somewhere there, what might come out of it is an actually much better solution to looking at problems than capitalism. I think places like Google, the Silicon Valley in general, they can seem a bit chilly. I mean, our speaker beforehand was saying also that sort of spray-on tan coat of futurity or fake excitement. But a lot of that happens mostly because the people that work there, they're all engineers and they're all quants and they all look at the world very, very rationally. And I said this earlier this afternoon, but if you really want to drive an engineer crazy, ask them what they think people are going to do with their technology once it's been created. And I don't care, I have my milestone, that's all I want to do. And I did meet this one guy at a fiber optic facility in New Jersey a few years ago, and I asked him if he thought about it, and he went, you know, sometimes it just gets depressing to come to work every day knowing that all you're really doing is trying to create a much more satisfying pornographic experience in the $29.95 price range. And I do think that there is this layer of utopianism that all people in tech seem to share. I mean, in any group in society, they're the ones that are anti-authoritarian, that really do want changes for the better. So I would say new technologies could solve the problems. Beware, there's something intrinsically creepy and boring about capitalism. And what's the third lesson from all this?
It's probably something to do with kittens.
No, it's like drones. Drones are the inevitable future.
Drones are kittens in disguise.
You cannot avoid drones.
One more question or comment?
We really went sideways on that last answer.
Hello, it's about the reading and the virtues of reading as a mode of progression, I think, is what you indicated at, or like escapism, or how you said it's ecotourism now.
Yeah, temporal
Temporal, I really like that. But you also said something about the science fiction just becoming fiction. I think that's a really interesting comment, that science fiction sort of lost, or it just got absorbed into mainstream fiction. It just became fiction. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about what that implements, or what that, you know, is that a problem? I mean, are we missing the myths of our time because we're actually living in the fictional writing of the 80s that was sci-fi, cyberpunk, you know, and all these different movements, and now can we locate these myths within contemporary society anymore?
I do think so. I think it's been William Gibson and Margaret Atwood are the two people who really pulled sci-fi out of the ghetto and sort of brought it into the mainstream culture. In a way, you might say what happened to sci-fi is what happened to gay culture, which used to have its own ghetto, usually its own neighborhood in any city, its own magazines, its own systems of getting information out. And now gay culture is just part of the mainstream culture. And there's, you know, that's a good thing, I think. Any idea, if it's a good idea, is going to break through, regardless if it's in a ghetto or not a ghetto. And people that write good sci-fi are also really good writers. So I have no worries in that sense. So, not me. What do you think about it? You read sci-fi?
No.
Did you ever?
No, I don't read sci-fi, but I avidly watch science fiction films.
Oh, okay.
So,
what did you think of Solaris?
the remake?
Yeah, well, compared to the original.
Okay. Which is which? Of course, it was terrible. But it was, you know, no, it was terrible. Okay, we're running out of time. I get to have the last question. So we've been talking a lot about how maybe we have become more and more immune to the either the pleasures or the perils of the future because we merely inhabit them. But I feel like certain things still kind of get through the cracks. So the most futuristic thing that I've heard in the last week is a term. I'd never heard this before, post-contemporary. And it feels really futuristic because I have no fucking clue what it means. I was wondering what the most futuristic thing you've heard in the last week or so, if anything.
Well, aside from the word digital, which we discussed, boy.
Well, you're completely immune to
The future?
There was the world's first penis transplant yesterday. Does that feel futuristic?
You know what? Well, yes, but you know what struck me is really, and this was last year, it was Angelina Jolie having a preemptive mastectomy because genetic testing indicated that she had the high, and I thought, like, holy shit, and this is a woman going in front of the entire planet talking about that was mind-blowing. And I think that in the short term, all the big things are going to come out of medicine. I'll end with this one sort of statement. What if there is no next big thing? What if all the big things are over? We had the wheel, we had fire, we had printing press, internet, Google, iPhones, that's it. There's not going to be anything more. Is that a good thing? Does that make you feel good about the future? Or would that just be depressing, living in a world where you're not even improving on new tech or pre-existing technologies? And what about, look at art. What if there's no new big thing in art? What if
there hasn't been for a long time?
Or art is over? Does that seem more probable or equally as implausible? But remember, the moment you say something's over is the moment it explodes. So I am expecting a lot from the art world very quickly. And I don't think technology is even going to take one day off from inverting the power systems in our lives and making them, if nothing else, more interesting.
Doug, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Shumon.
Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas Coupland and Mr. Shumon Basar. Big hand. Thank you.
To end on a really cheery note, the slogan on the back of our book.
You are the last generation that will die.
Nothing like ending on a happy note.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And on that note, thank you. There's drinks outside, and our thinking and making the future continues tomorrow.